So please turn your Bibles to Psalm chapter 139. We're going to finish up the second part of our study of this powerful psalm. While you're turning there, I want to share with you about a conversation that I had. I was teaching a class a few weeks ago on the nature of morality. That's just a big term to say we're talking about how do you know if something's right or wrong. And I'm not going to bore you with what I taught about that, but I did ask a very important question to my students that I want to throw out to you. Because this question I told them is so fundamental because you can't know right or wrong until you can ask this question yourself, and this is what it is. Why do you have moral value or worth? You think about that question, you really don't know what right or wrong is until you can start with the fact that you have moral value and worth. And if you have it, why do you have it? Where do you get it from? And so when class was over, I had one of my students come after, and she started to cry, telling me about her son. Because she was struggling with this very question of moral value and worth. Not only for her, but her son was struggling with it. You see, a week or so before the class, her son had tried to take his life. And she was desperate, trying to find answers to help give her son direction. And she said after he tried to commit suicide, they tried to get him help, but now he's even struggling even deeper. Now he's trying to figure out maybe there's something wrong with me. So he decided to go to school the next day and dress up as a girl, hoping that maybe that'll help fill the void. But through all these things that he's going through, she was struggling by trying to find out, not just for herself, but for her son, what? Why do you have moral value and worth? And this question is permeating our culture today. Because the story that I have with her is a story that I hear time and time again. And in fact, an article that I read, I just want to read a little bit of what it said, where it talks about how we are struggling right now as a culture to know why we have moral value and worth. The article says the following. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, the rates of mental health struggles among teens have been on the rise in the United States. By 2019, the number of children between the ages of 3 to 17 with a diagnosed mental behavioral health condition rose to over 8 million. The article then went on to specifically talk about how this has impacted teenage girls, which in 2021 they said there had been an increase of suicide attempts by 50%. One parent whose daughter took her life began to describe the emotional pain, and she said, after my daughter took my life, I went back to start reading her journals. And she goes, as I read her journals, I never knew the extent of the struggles that she went through. She went back to look at some of her daughter's social media posts, and she noticed that there were a number of photographs that her daughter would put up and then take down. In her own words, this is what the mother says about what her daughter had to go through. She said, I had no idea that she was that intensely into trying to perfect the image that she was putting out there. Another mother in the same article talked about her daughter who also took her life. And she said every day was a struggle for her daughter to hide her struggles of fear and shame that somehow people would find out, they would make fun of her. She said that she wanted to know who her true friends were but could not identify them. And she told her mom, she goes, Mom, every day I come home from school, I am exhausted because all I do is try to pretend something that I am not. Like these parents of this article, or the mother that I talked to, they were desperate. Desperate trying to find advice about how to help their children have one thing, choose life over death. Because I forgot to mention, when I was done talking to that mother, she said, I only have one desire for my son. And I said, what is that desire? And you would think for our children, what do we want? We want them to be successful, go out and be a sports star, succeed in academics, have a family. This is what she said, and I quote, my only desire for my son is that he will want to keep on living. That's where we're at as a culture. We have created a death culture, and people don't know where their moral value and worth is, so we have a generation of kids that are rising up and battling the very fundamental question, which we should all know, that we should choose life over death. And so in the short time that I had with that mother, and this is not because I was preaching on this, I said, do me a favor, go home and read Psalm 139. Now, why would I tell her to read this psalm? Because this psalm is so powerful. Because in this psalm are two fundamental truths that we have to reclaim for our culture, especially for the younger generation. And David points to these two truths in a powerful and mighty way. And here's the first truth, that we all have intrinsic value. When I use the word intrinsic, I'm talking about value in itself. Because what we have done as a society, we have stripped everyone of their intrinsic value, and we say that you only have extrinsic value, which means you only have value of what you can do for other people. So we look at a child in the womb of a mother, and we say, you do not have value until the mother says you have value. We look at young kids today and say, you do not have value unless you succeed in sports. You do well in school. You're part of the popular crowd. Then we look at older people and say, you only have value if you're still productive and can help other people. And what David reminds us in such a powerful way, that we have intrinsic value before we were even born. The second fundamental truth that David points out here is that there is a transcendent purpose. What have we raised our kids on? This idea that you're a cosmic accident. This is the life you have. Do the best you can, because when it's over with, you go to the grave and you're dead. No hope. And what we find out in this psalm is that we are not a result of a cosmic accident, but we have been divinely created by a God for a purpose that goes beyond this life. And so as I began last week to unpack the 12 verses of Psalm 139, we're going to look at the last 12. And what we're going to see is that David looks at his life through the lenses of the fact that he has intrinsic value and a transcendent purpose. And I look out there and I tell you, I'm exhausted. My heart is broken over how people I've talked to in the last month who are struggling with suicide or their children are. Because we're standing here right now, and the very question of why I have moral value and worth is a question that is the fundamental heart of our Christian faith. And I hope today that everyone's ears are open, because this is not a message just for younger kids, it's for all of us. Because in a culture that says you don't have value, you have no purpose, Jesus Christ is standing here today saying you have both of those. And David is going to reclaim this for us, and I hope that we will live our lives in light of what David is about to expound for us on this two powerful truths. But let me set the quick review. As if you weren't here last week, I want to talk about the first 12 verses, because they set the context for the last 12. We saw how David took two truths about God, the fact that he is all-knowing and he is all-present, and David applied them to his life. You see that you're going to hear a lot of theology, whether it's me, whether with the youth, or whether in the Bible studies, but theology does not have any value unless you can apply it to your life. And David does that thing. He says, okay, God, this is who you are. Let me apply it to my life. And we found out that David does something radical. He sees himself through the lenses of who God is. And that's what we have to do as a culture. We've got to stop buying the lies that we hear all around us and say, God, I will define myself by who you are. And so in verse 1, David begins to unpack God's personal knowledge of him. Not an intellectual knowledge, but he knows him personally. And he says in verse 1, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. And then from there, David unpacks from verse 2 to 5 the depth of God's knowledge of him. How he knows when he rises, when he sits down, he knows every little detail of his life. Then in verse 6, he says his conclusion about his knowledge that God has about him. He says, God, your knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Then going from God's knowledge, he transitions to God's presence in his life. And this is what David says in verse 7. He goes, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? And then what did David do? We saw in verse 8 through 10. David then applies, if I can't flee, let me try some locations I can go to. And everywhere David said he could go, guess what? He found God's presence there. And so as he's reflecting upon God's presence, he draws his powerful conclusion about it in verse 11 and 12. He says, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as day, for the darkness is as light with you. In other words, David's saying, God, your presence is like a constant light, even in the darkness. And we have been seeing great darkness in our culture, haven't we? This week with the school shootings and other things going on, it seems like there is so much darkness in our nation. And then you begin to look at your own life, and we hear about people losing family members, and we're like, man, there's so much darkness in my life. And what is David reminding us? I don't care how dark your situation is. The God that I serve, he is so powerful that his presence is like a light in the midst of that darkness. And that's what we had to reclaim from last week. Who is the God that you serve? Because when you serve a God like David, life has a different way of seeing things. But he doesn't end there, because now he's going to go into verse 13 through 15, and he's going to be unpacking those things we talked about. And the first one is this, the intrinsic value that we have. And I want you to understand, is David talking about himself? Yes, he is, but the application of what David shares, the truth that he talks about, is something that's relevant to all of our lives today. So in verse 13, David says, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. David is opening up about this value that he has by laying out two important truths about his existence. Not just his, but all of us here. Here's the first one. David says that he was a product of God's divine hand and not random chance. You're going to hear that all the time, this evolutionary lie. You just came here by a cosmic accident. David goes contrary to that. That's why I love preaching God's word. Because someone said, thank you for preaching God's word. I love it, because if you get mad at it, get mad at God, not me. I'm just here to proclaim what he says. And so God's very clear that, David's very clear, God, I am a product of your hand. And in fact, that Hebrew word for formed, maybe your translation has the word created, it means to purchase or possess. So what David is saying, he says, God, you have ownership not over my life, but over every human life. And because you have ownership over life, you have declared life to be what? Valuable and worthy. God put his stamp of approval on it. The world doesn't do that. God has put his stamp of approval on life, and he says, as the one who owns life, I have said it is valuable, it is worthy. The second truth that David points out is that God individually knew and cared for him even before he was born. That Hebrew word for knitted, and I'm not one who knits, maybe you are. But what David is referencing is how inside the womb of his mother, God was knitting him, or literally placing a cover or protection over him. David is very clear about this. This is not a political statement. It is a statement about how David sees God working in the development of his life, that life is sacred from the very moment of conception. You can argue even before conception. Because we are not simply a combination of cells, but according to David, we are a unique individual known and valued by God. And this is not a statement about what happens in the womb. This is a statement about life right now. Because in a culture today, we say, you know what? You have value or worth if you can do this, if you look like this, if you live here. But what is Scripture teaching us? Value of life is not what happens outside the womb. It starts within the womb. And so it doesn't matter the color of your skin, what socioeconomic status you have. God is saying everyone is equal. Everyone is valued by me because you are an image bearer of me. I've created you in my image. Man, what a truth to know that we need to reclaim in our culture today. Then David, if he hasn't given us enough in one verse, we go to verse 14. He goes on to add more to what he means by the fact that we have value. He says, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. You know, one of the greatest images that I have ever seen in my life was the ultrasound images of my children inside my mother's womb. I always tell people that is the closest that you ever get to heaven, to see that. Because as I'm watching my children being developed and being formed in my mother's womb, or my wife's womb, as I see them kicking, and one of the kids was sucking the thumb, and they still, for like 7 years after, were still sucking their thumb. But I'm watching this, and it's like, wow, I'm watching in amazement to see the movement and development within my wife's body. That oftentimes I can't even fathom the complexity of human life. So I was talking with Garrett the other day, who's got his biology degree, and he started to share something with me. I'm like, well, if I can't understand, I probably can't explain it. So I decided to read an article that talks about the complexity of our bodies. And by the way, this is a scientific article. It's not from a religious source. They just want to explain to you how complex we are. This is what they say. Did you know that each adult human body is estimated to have more than 46 miles of nerves and over 60,000 miles of blood vessels? Or that the brain alone has approximately 100 billion nerve cells? Or that just one foot is made up of 38 bones, 30 joints, and more than 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments, which all have to work in unison just to allow us to walk? And this secular science source, this is how they summarize the human body. There's no doubt about it. The human body is complex, perhaps the most complex machine on earth. And what scientists are telling us, David, in the quietness of his own time with God, said, you know what? We are fearfully and wonderfully made. We are a complex system that is beyond my imagination. What a reality. That God has spoken to David's heart, the very thing that scientists tell us about our bodies, that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. That Hebrew word wonderfully, we use the word all the time. Many of you guys probably watch It's a Wonderful Life, right, for Christmas. But the Hebrew word carries much more than just saying that's a wonderful day or a wonderful meal. It literally means to be separate or distinct. So when David says that I was wonderfully made, what David is saying is that, look at, God made me distinct and unique from all of creation. And not only me, but every human being that has breath right now is distinct from all creation. And why is that the case? Because you are an image bearer of God. You reflect the very image of your Creator. But that word even means more than just being distinct from creation around us. That means that each of us is individually distinct from each other. And as we will see, that's a powerful thing, because we're going to start to break down the fact that God has created us all individually, not just with value, but with our own purpose. And so when we think about the complexity of life and all that we see going on and how we came into existence, like David, his response should be our response, which is to praise God and say, God, your works are wonderful. People say, does God do miracles? Yes, he does. But the greatest miracle is life. Because if all those little details didn't come together, there would be no life. And what a blessing that God has provided that for us, and we should do like David, praise him for what he is and for what he has done. David moves on in verse 15. He says, my frame was not hidden from you. I want to stop right here. When David talks about his frame, he's talking about his bone and muscle system, the frame of his body. And once again, according to scientists, we have over 200 bones in our body and over 600 muscles. So what David is saying is, as you're forming the frame of my body, you already know me. It's like having a blueprint. Say you have an image of your mind right now of what you want your house to look like. And so you have a blueprint, right? Does the blueprint mean your house exists? No, it doesn't. But in your mind, you know exactly what it wants. And what David is saying is that God, before I was even formed, that blueprint was already in your mind about what I was going to look like. And so David says, for my frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. What David is saying is, you knew me before I was even born. This is powerful because I was just talking with a person the other day about abortion, and I don't want to make this political. I'll let God's word speak about where you should be when it comes to that issue. But this is what she told me. I believe the fetus has no moral value and worth until I can physically see it outside the womb. Strong statement. Now, I'm not here to tell you my viewpoint, but I'll tell you what David said, because in a poetic way, what does David say? He's saying, even in the darkness of the womb, where no other human knew that I even existed, I was known by you, God. In other words, David recognized that his value was not defined by his location or defined by the fact that others gave it to him. He had it because he was created in the image of God and known by God. That is a powerful statement because it transcends this whole idea of whether you're alive or not inside the womb, but it means that in life right now, all of us have value and worth. Because look, we all share one experience, or many. But one of them is this: we've all faced rejection, haven't we? We've all faced abandonment. We've all faced others look at us and say, you are not worthy, you are not valuable. But it doesn't matter what their opinion is, because your value and worth does not rest on what they think about you. Your value and your worth rest in the fact that you are known and created by God. You've got to reclaim that for your life right now. This younger generation has to reclaim that. Share that truth with your kids every single time they wake up. Remind them they are valued because they are created by God and He loves them. And David speaks so powerfully to this. And I'm passionate because every day I see this. Remember a phone call I told you guys a few months back where this person was contemplating suicide, and within hours they took their own life. I know the desperation that we live in our culture today. And what a powerful reminder, like David says, is before you were even born, before anyone knew you, you already had value and worth. And so David goes on here in verse 15 to say that he was woven inside the womb. This Hebrew word for woven, it pictures a person with a needle creating a beautiful blanket, kind of embroidery. I don't know if any of you ladies do that, or men, I guess men as well can do that. But I remember when my children were born, that one of the best gifts that we ever got were embroidered blankets. This church of older ladies gave every single newborn a blanket. And my children still have those blankets. Woven beautifully, a reflection of exactly what God does with His creation, with the human body, that while we're in the womb, what is God doing? He is creating a masterpiece of design and workmanship that reflects Him. So then we move on to verse 16, because David has laid out the fact that we have value and worth. But now David wants to remind us as well that we have a transcendent purpose. We are created with that. So he says in verse 16, your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Or like the New Living Translation, it says, every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. What is David saying? He says the details of my life from before conception until death were known by God. Everything that was going to happen in his life, God said, I already knew what was going to go on, David. I'm not shocked that you did this. I'm not shocked you went that direction. Everything from before conception until your death, I knew everything about. And that's a powerful truth for us to understand, that every day of our lives is perfectly known by God. And I don't know your response to that, but for David, he found comfort in that. He found comfort in the fact that God knew every single days of his life and what was going to happen. And it speaks in David's mind to the fact that if God knew every single day and God had ordained every day of my life, that means God had did what in David's life? Had created him with a purpose. We all have a purpose. Yes, the purpose is to know God and to make him known, but even beyond that, each of us individually been given talents and gifts by God, and he says, go out there and serve me with the purpose that I have given you. So God is not just here to form us for the sake of it, to say it's like, oh, I'm going to be a painter painting a picture so people can admire it. God has done that to show us that he has created us with a specific purpose that we're called to go out and live. And so what's David's conclusion? After reflecting upon the value and purpose of life, David comes to verse 17, 18, and gives this powerful conclusion. He says, how precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. As I awake, I am still with you. What David now is considering is the knowledge of God and how within inside the womb of his mother he was given value and purpose. And what's his response? He is amazed by the magnificence of God's knowledge that is beyond his ability to understand. And to explain the way he can't understand this, what does David say? He uses the image of a sand. Now, we've all been to the beach before, right? I don't know if you guys ever go on vacation to the beach. You ever have your kids say, man, I'm bored? Well, if they get bored, give them this challenge. Say, I want you to stay on the beach and start counting the grains of sand there. And see how long that lasts, right? Because that's what David says. He goes, go ahead. I can count the grains of sand, but the time for me to count all of them, which you'll never get to, is how God thinks about him every day, beyond his imagination. That's not only how God thinks about David, it's how God thinks about us as well. So before I move on to the final section here, I want to draw 2 points, that at least as I'm reading this passage, 2 questions that came to my mind that I think have conclusions. And here's the first conclusion for the questions that came to my mind, is that we must trust God over what we do not know. We talked about this last week. We are going to go through moments in our lives we don't fully understand why God is letting us go through that. Because if God knows every single day of my life, what's the obvious question we should ask God? If you knew this was going to be a bad day, could we have maybe fast-forwarded that day and gone to another day? If you knew I was going to have a horrible season in my life, if you knew that my mother, my father, my friends were going to treat me this way, could you have not fast-forwarded those moments of my life? But the reality is, I can give you some whys. I can tell you we reap what we sow because of our freedom. I could tell you God is using that situation to draw you closer. But if I'm going to be honest like David was before God, sometimes I cannot tell you why. Because God's ways are not my ways, neither are they your ways. But the power of not knowing why makes us go forward, because it leads us to the second issue here, which is that we still can rejoice that God thinks about us and cares for us. David said he considered it precious, or he treasured the fact that God thought of him and cared for him. Even those moments where he didn't know why he was going through, he said, God, I know that you are there, that you care for me, and it is precious in my mind that you are there for me. And so what I want you to do is go out and enjoy the beautiful sunshine. Now, as you look at the sky and you look at the trees around you and the beautiful parts of nature, I want you to think about this. The God that created all of that created you, and you are precious in his sight. And like David, I hope that will remind you, like he felt, man, what it is to know that I am comforted and cared by the creator of all of this around me. So it's from here we go to verse 19 and 22, and I'm going to be honest with you. I would have liked to have skipped this section. Because right now it's great, value and purpose, but then David goes in a different direction, but we can't bypass this because there's a powerful lesson David wants us to learn. So this is what David says. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. It's like, David, what are you doing? He just got done talking about the value and purpose of life, right? Now he's saying, I hate people. Not only does David say he hates them, he goes, I hate them with a complete hatred. Sounds like it's a contradictory statement, because doesn't Jesus say, love your enemies? Something we learned a few weeks ago. But I think to understand what David is saying, we have to understand the context. What has David just taught us? That it is because of God that we have value and purpose. And so what David is stepping back and saying, God, there are some people who don't recognize that value and purpose. Rather than glorify and honor you, they disobey you. They run it contrary to the value that you gave them. They distort it, they destroy it, and the purpose that you gave them, they waste it. And so now David is saying what many of us say, God, I hate those who do not honor and glorify you. Because we are in a culture right now where every single day we are teaching young kids, this is God's design for you for value and purpose, but let's twist it and do it the way you want to do it. And then we wonder why mental health is going up. We wonder why people are struggling with not wanting to live, because you have taken the very design of God's value and purpose in your life and you have twisted it. And David is angry about it. He's angry about those who will go against what God has called us to do. And we all can relate, but there's some truths about what David says in his prayer that we need to remember. And the first one is this. David's hatred was not directed toward those who, David's hatred was directed toward those who opposed God, not those who opposed him. Do you hear what I said? His hatred is for those who hate God, not who hate him. Because we look at David's life. Did he have a lot of people who hated him? Yes, he did. One guy by the name of King Saul hated David, tried to kill him. What does David do throughout the whole time that conflict with Saul? What does he do? Extends mercy and forgiveness and love to Saul. And what David says is, I hate those who oppose you, God, specifically because they speak maliciously about you and they take your name in vain. In other words, God, these are ones who attack your very character. They're the ones who say, God, you don't know what it means to have value and worth. You don't know what it means to have purpose for my life. And we see this going every day in our culture. We are attacking the very value and purpose God has given us and trying to twist it to our own ways. But here's a self-reflection question for all of you, myself included. Do you have the same hatred David does when others insult God and take his name in vain? I mean, do you? Because look, if we're honest with ourselves, we sit around every day watching television, listening to music, being entertained by those who take the Lord's name in vain and profane him every day. And we have no problem with it. I don't say that judgmentally, I say that sitting with you guys as well. Should we not have the same zeal that David did? Because what's driving David here? It's not hatred. Please understand that. It is love for God. And out of a love for God, he hates the very thing that opposes God, that opposes the value he's given us, that opposes the purpose that he has given us in our lives. And so David will not sit there and be entertained or tolerate those who celebrate a spirit of rebellion against God. That gives us to our second point. David's hatred was out of a desire to be loyal to God. David said, look, my culture may go this way, but my commitment is to follow my God. I will serve him and not this world. One commentary said it so well, so I'll let them say it better than I could. It said, David went against the spirit also evident in our day, against the idea that we can love God without hating evil. Did you hear what I said? To love God is to hate that which opposes God. To love God is to hate evil, to hate the very thing that says, God, your understanding of value and purpose is wrong. David was too loyal to God to allow it to go on. And so he stood opposed to that which was opposition to God. And the last part of this is David's hatred was a declaration for God to bring justice and righteousness. David literally grieved in his heart against everything that opposed God. And he said, God, will you come back and fix this? This week, how many of you got on your knees and cried to God and said, God, with this school shooting, with all the things going on, will you just come back and fix the problem? Will you take care of evil? Will you bring justice? Will you remove all the people doing evil? We've all prayed that, right? God, just eradicate them, get rid of them. So before we start to say David was wrong, we all understand because we all have the same emotions, but this is the power of David and why I believe that God had David anointed to apply this part of this psalm. Because David recognized that his emotions had to be properly assessed by God. And so what does David do? He sets us up in the final two verses because here's David. God, you give me value, give me purpose, and I oppose those who oppose you, who distort the value and purpose you have given us. But now David says, okay, God, it's time for you to check my heart now. It's time to make sure that I'm honoring you. And so David closes with these two powerful verses. He says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thought. See if there be any grievous way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. You see, David knew two things. Number one, there's wickedness around him. And number two, there was wickedness in his own heart. And so David said, God, I can sit here and I can evaluate my own heart, but my evaluation doesn't mean anything. You know whose evaluation means something? You. And your evaluation of my heart is what matters the most. And by the way, who's David? In Acts, it says he is a man after God's own heart. So even he said, it's time for you to evaluate my heart. And I love this because David just got done saying, I hate those who oppose you. So David is saying, rather than me being self-righteous and thinking I've got it all together, God, you come now and you assess me now. You make sure that I'm walking in loyalty towards you. You're making sure that I love you for the value and purpose that you've given me. You make sure, God, that the value you've given me in my life, I am not wasting. I'm not wasting the purpose you've called me to. And so David says very clear, search me and know my heart. That means examine my motives. He says, know my thoughts, know what's inside of me that no one else can see. He says, see if there be any grievous way in me. In other words, that grievous refers to anything that causes conflict. This is beautiful. David is saying, God, if there's something in me that is grievous to you, that's causing conflict in my relationship, get it out. When's the last time you got on your knees and said, God, if I am grieving you right now, there's something in my life causing conflict with you, get it out. I don't care if it's a relationship, if it's a job, I will sacrifice anything, God, because my relationship with you is the most important. That's what David is saying. Then he says, lead me in the way everlasting. In other words, lead me on a path of holiness that will allow me to have an unhindered fellowship with God. I told you last week, it wasn't that David just recognized God's relationship with him. He desired it. In this final two verses is David stepping back and saying, I know who you are. I see the wickedness in the world, God. But at the end of the day, search me. Make sure I'm in a proper place with you. So I close with this two quick challenge. And the first one is this. We have got to approach life with the fact that we have intrinsic value and a transcendent purpose. We've got to reclaim this for our culture right now, especially young people out there. Don't let the lies of the enemy begin to take away who you are in Christ. Because no matter what you may face, what others may say about you, what you may do, it doesn't change the fact that you have value and purpose. The sad reality is the enemy is telling you don't have it, then trying to use what you do have from God to use it in the wrong way. Don't buy the lie. You are valuable and you have a purpose in the eyes of God. And the second truth is this. That we have to approach life not just with value and purpose, but that we want God to transform us into who he wants us to be. That's what David's getting to. He saw the value and purpose. He saw those misusing, and he said, God, I want my life to be used the way you want it to be. And that's where it comes to where I always close my sermons, to the cross, right? Because the cross to me is the greatest symbol of value and purpose that we will ever experience in this life. Because we're all struggling right now to find it. Come on, we all admit it. We want that affirmation from our family members. We want that affirmation from our friends, from our coworkers, that somehow our life does have some significance and worth and value, and we don't need to do that anymore. Because at the cross, God has said, look, you are valuable in my eyes, and I have a purpose for your life that I'm going to send my son to sacrifice his life for you. There's no greater way I can explain to you the value that you have in God's eyes than the fact that Jesus gave his life for you. But please understand that we don't distort the truth of what Jesus did. He didn't just die because he loved you. You please understand that. He died because he wanted to transform you from the very thing that was sending you away from him, which is sin. Jesus gave his life to say, I love you, but I'm going to transform you into something new, something beautiful that I have created you to be. And what a powerful reminder every day when we see the cross that is in that symbol there, that I have value and worth, and that God can transform my heart. I want to close with all of us saying this prayer together because I think it's a powerful reminder of where we should be at in relationship to our walk with Christ. So let's all say it together, and I have it on the floor. Are you ready? Search us, O God, and know our heart. Try us and know our thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in us, and lead us in the way everlasting. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.